Hello, I wanted to take a moment and go over the different choices and options for setting up Hadoop inside of various environments. There seemed to be a little bit confusion because I'm offering alternatives that aren't necessarily spelled out. So let's kind of go through what those are. Whenever we talk about the Hadoop that we're going to be installing, it's basically a pseudo-distributed Hadoop instance. It's essentially a single node cluster. The choices are on the screen. They're basically kind of are grouped into kind of two or three different buckets. One is cloud-based hosted. That's what HDINSIGHT is. Managed service of Hadoop inside of Azure. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of it in a moment. Then your variations are to use a virtual machine running perhaps Linux. That's one choice, but be it running a virtual machine inside of the cloud or running it locally. The next approach is to run kind of a virtual machine, but it's the Windows subsystem for Linux. The next approach is to kind of variations is to run it inside of Windows itself rather than Linux, and to do so either on the local machine itself or a virtual machine. And there's lots of other choices that I'm not necessarily going to go over. So jumping straight into HDINSIGHT, there's plenty of positives about HDINSIGHT. It is relatively easy to set up. You have a web-based interface for doing most of the configuration. It's cloud hosted, and so you don't have to have any kind of local requirements. You do need an internet connection. That's something that is necessary to do that, but it doesn't have to be a terribly speedy one. Also, it can be relatively expensive. You pay for Hadoop HDINSIGHT clusters as long as they exist, whether they're running or not. So maybe not the best idea for what we're trying to do here. And they're also, what you're building, even the smallest HDINSIGHT cluster is probably more powerful than we really need for the assignments that are taken on during this course. Well, you do things that are relatively straightforward. And it's more about just figuring out how it works, not so much doing real distributed processing. Another alternative then is to go to virtual machines in the cloud. So to run Linux, install a Linux instance inside of the cloud, and then install Hadoop on it. The benefits of that is that you do get consumption-based pricing. You're only charged whenever it's running, not whenever it exists. So you can turn it off or set it to auto shut down. And so you don't have to pay for it if you're not using it. You do get the benefits of a virtual machine, such as things like snapshots, rollbacks, and so on, so you can basically capture the state of something and go back to it later if you need to. You do have access also to other cloud-based services, such as storage accounts, if that were necessary. Not necessarily really needed for what we do, but it is something that is important to keep in mind. The negatives requires that you do have to create an instance of a virtual machine. So you have to install either the Linux-based machine and then install Hadoop on top of it yourself, or find an instance of an image that has Hadoop already installed and utilize that. That is a viable option. I've played with one up there that does do pretty well, and it's neither one of those are not bad. But you are in the cloud, so you do have to have an internet connection to it. Another approach is to do similar concept, but do it locally. So rather than putting it on the cloud, you put it on your local machine. You have something like Hyper-V or VirtualBox running locally. You do get the same benefits of having virtual machines, so you can snapshot, roll back. Once you get it up and running, you don't have to be connected to the internet. Not that that necessarily matters a lot, but it is something to consider. And you do have local access to files, so you can access things that are on your local hard drive. The downside is you may have to download a relatively large, they're not huge, but a relatively large image to run locally. You also have to have resources on your computer to be able to run that image, so you need a reasonably modern computer of some sort with sufficient memory and processor power to run a virtual image. And also, you do have to either download an image that has Hadoop installed, such as maybe the Hortonworks Sandbox, or you have to download an image of a distribution of Linux and then install Hadoop on top of that. Not the end of the world, but definitely something that does take some time. A variation on that same theme is to use the Windows subsystem for Linux and install a Linux distribution inside of it, and then turn around and install Hadoop inside of that. The advantages you get are very similar to the offline VM approach. It's a little simpler to manage, though, because you don't have to deal with things like VirtualBox or Hyper-V, it's kind of hidden from you. You basically go to the Microsoft Store, download an application, what looks a lot like an application, acts like an application, install it, and then open it up and you're into a terminal onto a Linux distribution. The downside, though, is the same as with any image, and there's not an image that I found that already has Hadoop installed in the Microsoft Store, so you would have to download Hadoop and configure it. So that's kind of the downsides. Personally, this is my favorite. This is the one that I would probably recommend for most people. It is a bit newer in that Windows Subsystem for Linux is about maybe 5 or 6 years old, but it is a nice, highly integrated solution. An alternative is to install it directly into Windows. So you can download Hadoop and install it into your Windows-based machine, assuming you're running Windows. The benefits you get are similar to all the other ones where you're running it locally. You don't have to be connected to the cloud after you download whatever it is you need to download. You don't have to have an account on Azure or anything else. But you do have challenges, and there's a typo in the slide, where you don't have the benefits of a snapshot. So after you've done this, you potentially now have something on your computer until you go to the trouble of removing it or re-image the computer at some later date. So there is the potential of residue being left on your computer after you're done with this. Personally, I wouldn't do it too much, in part because Hadoop is meant for Linux. That's where it was created. You can run it locally. It is cross-platform. There are some challenges. So that's the reason I would think twice about doing it. Another approach is to do a variation on that same theme, but instead of doing it onto your base machine, install it inside of a VM that has Windows 10 installed. You get the ability then to do a clean deletion when you're done, so you don't have to worry about residue being stuck on your computer. But you do have still the challenges of Linux is Hadoop's home. It's where it kind of came from. As such, primary care is given to it, secondary care to getting it to run on Windows. So you could run into some challenges. So with that, again, my approach would be probably to go with something like the Windows Subsystem for Linux, primarily because it is a nice, elegant solution, and it balances between local execution, so I can open up a terminal and deal with things locally, access local files, and yet still be running on a true version of Linux. But again, lots of flexibility here, so do whatever you think makes the most sense. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk with you soon.